The evening of August 1917 settled over Cheyenne, Wyoming like a worn blanket, soft and familiar. On the porch of a weathered timber house at the edge of town, two figures sat in the amber glow of an oil lamp. The older man occupied a rocking chair that had known his weight for 20 years. The younger sat on the steps, his duffel bag already packed for the morning train that would carry him east, then across an ocean to trenches most Americans could not yet imagine. Samuel Blackwood was 94 years old. His hair fell silver past his collar. His beard, meticulously trimmed each morning, framed a face mapped with the geography of 9 decades. But his back remained straight as a lodgepole pine, and his eyes carried the clarity of a man who had spent a lifetime reading truth in the faces of liars. Those eyes now rested on his grandson with the weight of something unspoken, something that had waited years to be said. Thomas Blackwood was 18. He possessed his grandfather's blue eyes and the same angular jaw, though his face had not yet been carved by time or hardship. Tomorrow he would board a train bound for Camp Funston. 6 weeks after that he would sail for France. The Great War consumed young men with an appetite that seemed inexhaustible, and Thomas had volunteered despite his grandfather's careful silence on the matter. The old man cleared his throat. The sound carried across the porch like a judge's gavel. Thomas, before you leave for France, I need to tell you a story, not about catching outlaws or tracking bandits through the Rockies. This is about something different, something I have never told anyone, not even your grandmother. Thomas shifted on the step, intrigued. You mean you actually have a story you haven't told me? I thought I'd heard them all by now. Samuel allowed himself a thin smile. This one I kept locked away. It is about the most dangerous man I ever hunted. And to catch him, I had to do something no U.S. Marshal had ever done before. I had to pretend to be crippled. The word hung in the air between them. Thomas turned fully now, his young face serious. What do you mean? Samuel leaned back in the rocking chair. The wood creaked with familiar complaint. His gaze drifted past the porch rail, past the dusty street, past the present moment entirely until his vision settled on a different time. It was 1891. I was 68 years old. Should have been retired already. Your grandmother Margaret had passed 6 months earlier. Consumption took her slowly, the way it takes everyone who cannot afford the good doctors in Denver. I was alone in our house for the first time in 43 years. Empty rooms have a way of making a man question what purpose he still serves in the world. He paused. Thomas waited, knowing his grandfather's stories arrived in their own time, measured and deliberate. Margaret said something to me before she died. She made me promise not to let grief turn me bitter. She told me to find one last job, something that mattered, something that would give my final years meaning. I spent 6 months searching for that job. Then Jacob Miller died, and I found it. Samuel's voice shifted register, dropping into the tone of a man who had walked into a room and discovered something wrong. Thomas recognized that tone. It meant the story had truly begun. The transition felt seamless, like stepping through a doorway from one world into another. The porch faded. Cheyenne in 1917 dissolved into Cheyenne in 1891, and Samuel Blackwood was no longer an old man in a rocking chair, but a widower of 68 reading a newspaper at his desk in the U.S. Marshal's office. March of 1891 arrived cold and bitter. The headline in the Cheyenne Daily Leader struck Samuel like a fist to the sternum. Major Jacob Miller, hero of Antietam, dies in tragic accident at age 52. The article offered few details. A fall down the stairs in his barn, a broken neck. Sheriff Dalton Hayes of Laramie County had investigated and concluded the death was accidental, tragic, but not suspicious. A disabled veteran living alone, the sheriff explained, faced daily risks that able-bodied men never considered. Samuel read the article 3 times. Each reading tightened the knot in his chest. Jacob Miller had served in the same regiment as Samuel during the war between the states. They had stood shoulder to shoulder at Shiloh, at Stones River, at Chickamauga. Jacob lost his left leg at Gettysburg when a Confederate cannonball turned a stone wall into shrapnel. Samuel had carried him 2 miles to the field hospital, Jacob screaming the entire way, begging Samuel to leave him and save himself. Samuel had refused. Jacob survived. The surgeons took the leg 6 inches below the hip. After the war, Jacob received 160 acres under the Homestead Act. He built a small ranch in Laramie County, raised horses, lived quietly. Samuel had visited him twice over the years. The man who greeted him both times walked with a wooden leg and a cane, but his eyes remained sharp and his mind sharper. Jacob Miller was not a man who fell downstairs. Samuel folded the newspaper with deliberate care. He retrieved his hat from the rack by the door and rode 40 miles to Laramie County without telling anyone where he was going. The Miller Ranch sat in a shallow valley where spring grass grew thick when the rains came. This year, the grass grew sparse and yellow. Drought had plagued Wyoming for 2 seasons, and Jacob's modest herd of horses had dwindled to 3 animals too old to sell. The barn stood with its paint peeling, the house with its porch sagging, but the property itself held value. It sat directly in the path of the proposed Denver-Cheyenne rail line expansion, though Jacob had never known that when he claimed it. Samuel dismounted and tied his horse to the rail. The front door stood unlocked. Inside, dust covered the furniture in a way that spoke of weeks rather than days. He moved through the kitchen, past the bedroom where Jacob had slept alone since his wife died of influenza in 1889, and into the barn. The stairs led from the main floor to the loft where Jacob stored hay. 15 steps, each one worn smooth by 20 years of use. A sturdy handrail ran along both sides. Samuel climbed them slowly, examining each tread. No oil, no water, no loose boards. At the top, he turned and looked down. 8 feet from the base of the stairs, a dark stain marked the dirt floor where Jacob's body had lain. Samuel descended and knelt beside it. The stain was too far from the stairs. A man falling would land close to the bottom step, perhaps 2 feet away. This stain suggested Jacob had been thrown or pushed with considerable force. Samuel studied the barn with the practiced eye of a man who had spent 42 years reconstructing violence from its aftermath. Scuff marks near the 4th step from the bottom. A handprint in the dust on the railing too large to be Jacob's. The window beside the barn door showed signs of forced entry, the wood around the latch splintered from outside pressure. He spent an hour documenting everything in the small notebook he always carried. Then he rode to the neighboring property, a modest homestead owned by a widow named Dorothy Chen. Mrs. Chen was 60 years old, a woman whose husband had died in a mining accident a decade earlier. She lived alone and grew vegetables and missed nothing that happened within a mile of her land. When Samuel introduced himself, she invited him inside for coffee without hesitation. Marshals were still respected in 1891, even retired ones. "I saw them," she said, before Samuel could ask his first question. 2 weeks before Jacob died. 2 men came to his property in a fancy buggy. One wore a suit like he was from back east. The other was big as a barn, built like he broke rocks for pleasure. I watched them knock on Jacob's door. Heard Jacob shouting at them to leave. He came outside with his rifle and fired a shot into the air. They left after that, but the man in the suit did not look angry. He looked patient, like a man who knew he would get what he wanted eventually. Samuel leaned forward. "Did you hear what they argued about?" Mrs. Chen shook her head. But 3 days later, Jacob came to see me. He looked worried. Said if anything happened to him, I should remember that he would never sell his land, not for any price. He made me promise to tell someone if he died under strange circumstances. Then 2 weeks later, he was dead. What did the sheriff say when you told him this? Mrs. Chen's face hardened. I told Sheriff Hayes everything. He wrote it down, thanked me politely, and did nothing. Said Jacob was a crippled old man living alone, and accidents happen. He closed the case in 2 days. Samuel finished his coffee and thanked Mrs. Chen for her time. He rode back to Cheyenne with his jaw clenched so tight his teeth ached. At the marshal's office, he pulled files going back 18 months. He cross-referenced every accidental death in Laramie County with property ownership records. The pattern emerged like a photograph developing in chemical solution, slowly but undeniably. 7 men, all Civil War veterans, all disabled from service-related injuries, all homesteaders who owned land in Laramie County, all dead within 18 months under circumstances ruled accidental by Sheriff Dalton Hayes. Corporal Bill Hodges, 49 years old, blind in his left eye from a bayonet wound at Cold Harbor. Died when his horse supposedly kicked him in the head. Owned 160 acres. The land sold to Laramie Land Company 3 weeks after his death for $1,200. Market value $4,000. Sergeant Tom Wade, 54, missing his right arm below the elbow from an artillery shell at Petersburg. Drowned in a creek that ran 18 inches deep during the dry season. Owned 320 acres. Sold to Laramie Land Company for $2,000. Market value $6,000. Private Owen Mills, 47, walked with a severe limp from a hip wound at Shiloh. Fell from a cliff he had climbed safely 100 times before. 160 acres. Sold to Laramie Land Company. The list continued. Lieutenant Carl Ross paralyzed on the left side of his face. Captain James Dunn missing his right leg. Private Luke Shaw deaf from standing too close to cannon fire. All dead, all accidental, all their land purchased by the same company. Samuel spread the files across his desk and stared at them until the oil lamp burned low. 7 good men dead. 7 families robbed. 1 company enriching itself on blood and fraud. He opened the file on Laramie Land Company. It had been incorporated in January of 1889, right as the drought began creating financial pressure on small landowners. The principal owner was listed as Harrison Vance, a businessman from Boston with no prior connection to Wyoming. In 18 months, Vance had acquired over 1,500 acres in a corridor that perfectly aligned with the proposed rail expansion. Samuel closed the files and sat in the darkness. His hands, weathered and scarred from 4 decades of hard use, rested flat on the desk. He thought about Margaret, about her final words, about the promise he had made. This was the job. This was what mattered. But catching Harrison Vance and whoever worked for him would require more than a badge and a gun. These men were careful. They killed in ways that looked accidental. They bribed local law enforcement. They hid behind corporations and lawyers. Traditional investigation would find nothing they could not explain away in court. Samuel needed them to reveal themselves. He needed to become the kind of target they could not resist. He needed to become prey. The plan took shape over 2 weeks of careful preparation. Samuel would create a false identity, a persona so perfectly tailored to Harrison Vance's pattern that the man would have no choice but to make his move. But this persona could not be a simple disguise. It had to be complete, documented, legally sound. It had to become real enough to fool lawyers and land clerks and sheriffs who took bribes. The identity would be that of Caleb Thornton, a 65-year-old veteran of the Union Army who had served as a sergeant and sustained a crippling leg injury at the Battle of Shiloh. Caleb would own 240 acres of prime land in eastern Laramie County, land that sat directly in the path of the coming railroad. He would be a widower, isolated, drowning in debt. He would be perfect. But to become Caleb Thornton, Samuel would have to do something he had never done in 42 years as a lawman. He would have to learn how to be weak. The workshop of Lars Johansson sat on the outskirts of Cheyenne, a low building that smelled of pine shavings and varnish. Johansson was a carpenter from Norway who had come west after the war and discovered a profitable trade building prosthetic limbs for veterans who could not afford the fancy mechanical devices from back east. His wooden legs were simple but functional, and he asked no questions about why a retired U.S. Marshal needed one that could be easily removed and reattached. "It must look genuine from a distance," Samuel explained, "but I need to be able to take it off and walk normally when no one is watching." Johansson studied Samuel's left leg, taking measurements with a cloth tape. "You understand this will hurt. To sell the illusion, you will need to keep your real leg bent and strapped against your thigh for hours at a time. The muscles will cramp, the circulation will suffer. You will develop real pain in your hip and back from the unnatural gait." Samuel nodded. "I understand. Why are you doing this?" "Because 7 good men are dead and the people who killed them believe disabled veterans are easy prey. I intend to show them they are wrong." Johansson returned to his workbench without another word. 3 days later, he delivered a prosthetic leg carved from ash wood, lightweight but sturdy, with a clever system of leather straps that allowed Samuel to secure his real leg in a bent position against his thigh. The device added an inch to Samuel's height on that side, forcing an authentic limp. A hollowed compartment in the calf could hold a small pistol or lockpicks. Samuel practiced in his barn for 6 weeks. 4 hours each morning, he strapped on the device and relearned how to walk. The limp had to look natural, born of years of adaptation rather than recent injury. He studied how men with missing limbs distributed their weight, how they navigated stairs, how they struggled with simple tasks able-bodied men took for granted. He taught himself to wince at the right moments, to pause before sitting, to lean heavily on the walking stick that Johansson had also crafted. The pain Johansson warned about arrived within days. Samuel's hip joint screamed in protest. His lower back developed a constant ache. But the discomfort served a purpose. It made the performance genuine. By the end of 6 weeks, Samuel could don the prosthetic and become Caleb Thornton so completely that he half believed it himself. While Samuel practiced physical transformation, he built the legal foundation for his new identity. Judge Martin Cooper, a friend of 30 years, helped him create documents that would pass any scrutiny. A land deed for 240 acres properly recorded with the county clerk. A medical discharge from the Union Army, dated 1862, signed by a doctor who had actually served at Shiloh and owed Samuel a favor from a case years earlier. A marriage certificate and a death certificate for a fictional wife named Mary who had supposedly died during the influenza epidemic of 1889. Samuel opened a bank account in Caleb Thornton's name with $200. He rented a small ranch property from a friend who knew his real purpose and agreed to let Samuel use it for his operation. He furnished the house with cheap, worn furniture and let the exterior fall into deliberate disrepair. To anyone investigating, Caleb Thornton would appear to be exactly what Harrison Vance hunted, a vulnerable, isolated veteran, clinging to land he could no longer afford to keep. The final piece of the puzzle was Deputy Marshal James Cole, a young lawman of 28 who had served under Samuel for 3 years. Cole possessed the rare combination of intelligence and restraint that Samuel valued. He could follow orders, keep secrets, and think on his feet when plans collapsed. "You will be my eyes and ears when I cannot risk breaking character," Samuel explained as they sat in the office late one evening. "You will pose as a drifter who does odd jobs around the ranch. If Vance or his men come after me, you will be close enough to intervene. But unless I am in immediate danger of death, you do not reveal yourself. I need them to commit fully before we spring the trap." Cole nodded slowly. "Marshal, this is dangerous beyond anything I have seen you attempt. You are asking these men to try to kill you." Samuel met his eyes without blinking. "I am asking them to reveal their true nature. Predators only show their teeth when they believe their prey is helpless. I need Harrison Vance to believe I am helpless. And if they succeed in killing you before I can stop them, then you arrest them for murdering a U.S. Marshal and the case still closes. Either way, they pay for what they have done." Cole looked away, troubled but unable to argue with the logic. When he looked back, his jaw was set. "I will keep you alive, sir. You have my word." By the first week of May 1891, Samuel Blackwood had ceased to exist in Laramie County. In his place shuffled Caleb Thornton, a broken man clinging to the only thing he had left. The test came on a Saturday afternoon. Samuel, fully transformed into Caleb, walked into a saloon in Laramie. The prosthetic bit into his thigh despite the padding. His hip throbbed with each step. He leaned heavily on his walking stick, letting the wood take half his weight. He had not shaved in a week. His clothes hung loose on his frame, deliberately chosen 2 sizes too large to suggest a man wasting away. He ordered whiskey at the bar. His hand trembled as he lifted the glass. Not from nerves, but from genuine muscle fatigue. The performance had become real. The bartender, a thick-necked man who had seen every type of customer the West produced, glanced at Samuel with casual pity. "You new around here," Samuel let his voice come out thin and uncertain. "I have land east of town. Do not come in much. This leg makes travel difficult." "War injury, Shiloh, 1862. Doctor said I was lucky to keep the leg at all." "Some days I am not so sure." The bartender nodded and moved on to another customer. Samuel sat in the corner nursing his whiskey, watching the room in the mirror behind the bar. After 20 minutes, a man in a well-tailored black suit rose from a table near the back and walked over. Richard Crane was 40 years old, broad-shouldered and thick through the chest. His hands were large and callous despite his expensive clothes. He had the look of a man who had done hard labor in his youth and never quite washed it off no matter how much he spent on tailoring. His eyes moved across Samuel with the practiced assessment of someone who made a living evaluating weakness. "Excuse me, friend, I could not help but overhear. You own land east of town." Samuel turned slowly, making the movement look painful. "I do." "Why do you ask?" Crane smiled. It was a smile that never reached his eyes. "My name is Richard Crane. I work for the Laramie Land Company. We help landowners who are struggling with the current economic conditions. The drought has been hard on everyone. If you are having difficulty making ends meet, we might be able to assist." Samuel studied him, letting suspicion and hope war visibly on his face. "What kind of assistance?" "We purchase land at fair prices, helping folks move on to more manageable situations. The money can ease financial burdens, set a man up comfortably for his remaining years. The phrase remaining years landed like a stone in still water. Samuel absorbed it, let it show in the tightening of his jaw. I am not looking to sell. My wife is buried on that land. Crane's expression shifted to practiced sympathy. I understand. These decisions are never easy, but circumstances sometimes force our hand. If you ever change your mind, the company is always interested in speaking with landowners. He placed a card on the bar. The paper stock was expensive, the printing crisp. Laramie Land Company, it read. Harrison Vance Principal. Richard Crane Land Acquisition. Samuel pocketed the card without looking at it. I will keep it in mind. Crane returned to his table. Samuel finished his whiskey and left the saloon maintaining his labored gait all the way to his horse. He knew Crane was watching. He knew the evaluation had begun. 3 days later, Richard Crane arrived at the ranch. He came in a buggy pulled by a matched pair of bay horses that cost more than most men earned in a year. Samuel, watching from the porch, let himself be caught sitting in a rocking chair with his bad leg propped on a stool, the picture of a man at the end of his strength. Crane climbed down from the buggy with athletic ease. His smile was broad and friendly as he approached. Mr. Thornton, I hope you do not mind the unannounced visit. I was passing by and thought I would check on you. We had such a brief conversation the other day. Samuel gestured to a second chair. I appreciate the concern, though I am not sure what more there is to discuss. Crane settled into the chair, his eyes sweeping the property with quick, calculating glances. The ranch house, Samuel knew, looked exactly as he wanted it to look. The porch sagged slightly, paint peeled from the window frames. The barn had a visible hole in the roof where shingles had blown off during the winter. The entire property whispered financial distress. Mr. Thornton, I will be direct because I believe you are a man who appreciates honesty. Your property sits in an area of significant interest for upcoming development. The railroad expansion will pass within a mile of here. Land values should increase substantially once that happens. Samuel nodded slowly. So why would I sell now instead of waiting? Crane leaned forward, his voice dropping into a tone of confidential concern. Because the tax assessments will increase, along with the land values. The county is already preparing to raise rates to fund infrastructure improvements. For a man on a fixed pension, those increases could be devastating. Better to sell now at a fair price than to be forced to sell later when you are underwater on tax debt. The argument was smooth practiced, convincing. It was also complete fabrication. Samuel had checked with the county assessor. No rate increases were planned. How much are you offering? For 240 acres in this condition, we could do $900. Samuel let his face show shock that was only partially feigned. 900, this land is worth at least 3,000. Crane's expression remained sympathetic but firm. In better times, perhaps, but the drought has devastated property values. Most banks will not even loan against ranch land right now. $900 is generous considering current market conditions. Samuel shook his head. I need to think about this. It is too much to decide quickly. Crane stood. Of course. Take your time. But Mr. Thornton, I should mention that tax payments are due in 1 month. If you cannot pay, the county will seize the property and you will receive nothing. $900 is better than zero. He walked back to his buggy. Before climbing in, he turned back. One more thing. Men in your situation living alone with limited mobility, accidents can happen easily. A fall, a fire, any number of unfortunate events. I hope you are taking proper precautions. The threat arrived wrapped in concern, but it was unmistakable. Samuel watched Crane drive away, maintaining his posture of worry and confusion until the buggy disappeared over the rise. Then he stood, walked inside, and removed the prosthetic with relief that bordered on euphoria. Deputy Cole emerged from the barn where he had been listening. He looks like he breaks bones for pleasure. Samuel rubbed circulation back into his leg. That is exactly what he does, but he is not the real target. Harrison Vance is the man we need to reach. Crane is just the arm that does the work. What happens now? Now I refuse to sell, and we wait to see how far they are willing to go. The refusal came in a letter delivered by Cole, who posed as a friend helping the barely literate Caleb communicate. The message was polite but firm. Mr. Thornton appreciated the offer, but had decided to keep his land. He hoped the company would respect his decision. The response arrived 4 days later. Samuel, alone at the ranch, saw the buggy approach an hour before sunset. Not Crane this time. The man who climbed down wore a suit that cost more than the buggy and the horses combined. He was tall and lean with the angular face of someone who had never done a day of physical labor. Wire-rimmed spectacles caught the dying light. Harrison Vance had come personally. Samuel met him on the porch, leaning on his stick, breathing hard as if the effort of standing had taxed him. "Mr. Thornton, I apologize for arriving unannounced. I am Harrison Vance. I believe you received our offer through Mr. Crane." Samuel nodded. "I did, and I sent my answer." Vance smiled. It was a different kind of smile than Crane's, colder and more calculated. "You did indeed. But I felt the matter warranted a personal conversation." "May I sit?" Samuel gestured to the chair. Vance settled into it with the careful grace of a man who treated every movement as a calculated choice. "Mr. Thornton, I am going to speak plainly because I believe you are an intelligent man despite the unfortunate circumstances you find yourself in. This land will be purchased by someone. The railroad needs the right-of-way, and eminent domain proceedings have already begun. The question is not whether you will lose this property. The question is whether you will receive fair compensation or be left with nothing." Samuel studied him. "Is that a threat, Mr. Vance?" "It is a reality. I am offering you a way to benefit from an inevitable change. Others in your situation have been grateful for such an opportunity. Others like Bill Hodges, Tom Wade, Owen Mills." Vance's expression did not change, but something flickered behind his eyes. "You knew these men. We served together. I heard they all died in accidents after refusing to sell their land." Vance tilted his head slightly. "Tragic coincidences. But they did sell their land before they died, Mr. Thornton. Their families received fair payment. At least they had that comfort. The admission hung between them bold and brazen." Vance was not trying to hide his involvement. He was demonstrating it, showing that he operated with impunity. Samuel let his voice crack slightly. "Are you saying the same thing will happen to me? If I refuse, I am saying that life is uncertain, particularly for men in your condition. Accidents happen with distressing frequency, but they rarely happen to people who make wise decisions." The mask had slipped. The civilized businessman had revealed the predator beneath. Samuel felt a cold satisfaction settle in his chest. This was what he needed, but it was not yet enough. He needed more. He needed witnesses. He needed Vance to go further. "I will think about your offer," Samuel said carefully. Vance stood. "I hope you will. But time is short, Mr. Thornton, very short indeed." He left as the sun touched the horizon. Samuel watched until the buggy disappeared, then went inside and documented every word of the conversation in his notebook. That night, a rock shattered his bedroom window. Tied to it was a note written in crude block letters, "Stubborn men die alone." Samuel examined the note by candlelight. The paper was good quality, the kind sold at the general store in Laramie. The handwriting tried to look uneducated, but showed too much control. This was a literate man pretending otherwise. He slept with his Colt .45 under his pillow and his real leg free of the prosthetic. If they came tonight, the performance would end in gunfire. They did not come. But the next morning, Samuel found his chicken coop destroyed and 8 birds dead, their necks wrung, with methodical efficiency. The message was clear. 2 days later, 3 young men confronted him in the street in Laramie. They worked for Vance, though they would deny it under oath. They pushed Samuel into an alley while a dozen witnesses looked away. One put a knife to his throat. "Listen, old man, smart people sell when they get a fair offer. Stupid people have accidents." "Which are you?" Samuel, committed to the role, trembled convincingly. "I just want to be left alone. Then sell your land, and we will leave you alone. You have 3 days. They left him in the dirt. Sheriff Dalton Hayes stood 20 feet away watching. When Samuel looked at him, the sheriff turned and walked away. Samuel brushed himself off and limped back to the ranch. His performance was working. They believed him weak, helpless, ripe for the taking. But belief was not enough. He needed them to act on it. He needed them to commit murder while he and Cole were ready to stop it and document it. That night, Samuel removed the prosthetic and sat in his darkened house. The Colt rested on the table beside him. Outside, Cole watched from the barn, armed and alert. They were ready. But the attack did not come that night either. Harrison Vance was too careful, too patient. He would strike when the moment was perfect, when his risk was minimal. Samuel realized he would have to force the moment. On the porch in 1917, Samuel paused in his telling. Thomas sat motionless on the step, completely absorbed. The performance had reached the point where it had to escalate, Samuel said quietly. I had them interested. I had them threatening. But I needed them to act. And to get them to act, I had to give them both opportunity and pressure. What did you do? Thomas asked. Samuel smiled, though there was no humor in it. I went to Harrison Vance's office in the middle of the night, and I made sure he knew it. The story had reached its turning point. The prey was about to become the hunter, though Vance would not know it until far too late. The office of Laramie Land Company occupied the second floor of the finest building in town, a brick structure that stood in deliberate contrast to the weathered wood and false fronts that lined the rest of Main Street. Harrison Vance had chosen the location with the same calculation he applied to everything else. Height meant visibility. Visibility meant legitimacy. And legitimacy was the best disguise for theft conducted in daylight. Samuel approached the building at 10:30 on a Monday morning. He had chosen the time carefully, late enough that Vance would be settled into his workday, early enough that the streets still held witnesses who could confirm that Caleb Thornton, the crippled veteran, had arrived for a business meeting of his own volition. The stairs to the second floor presented a challenge that Samuel navigated with deliberate slowness. Each step required visible effort. He paused at the landing, breathing hard, leaning heavily on his walking stick. A woman descending from the floor above gave him a sympathetic glance and asked if he needed assistance. Samuel waved her off with a trembling hand and continued upward. The door to Vance's office stood open. Inside, mahogany furniture gleamed with fresh polish. A map of Laramie County dominated one wall marked with red pins that Samuel recognized immediately as the properties Vance had acquired. The pins formed a nearly continuous line from north to south. Only a few gaps remained, and Samuel knew that 240 acres of Caleb Thornton's land sat directly in one of those gaps. Harrison Vance looked up from his desk. His expression showed no surprise at Samuel's arrival. He had been expecting this. Men like Vance always knew when pressure had ripened into capitulation. Mr. Thornton, please sit. I am glad you reconsidered. Samuel lowered himself into the offered chair with theatrical difficulty. The prosthetic ground against his thigh despite the padding. The pain it created showed on his face without any need for performance. I have not reconsidered, Samuel said. His voice came out rough and uncertain, the voice of a man who had spent 3 sleepless nights wrestling with an impossible decision. But I need to understand what you are truly offering. $900 is not enough to live on for long. Vance folded his hands on the desk. His fingers were long and pale, the nails manicured. They were hands that had never held a shovel or a gun, hands that signed papers while other men did the bloody work. Mr. Thornton, let me be frank with you, because I believe you deserve honesty. $900 is our standard offer for properties in your situation. However, I have some discretion in special cases. If you agree to close the transaction within the week, I could increase the offer to $1,200. Samuel let hope flicker across his face, then crushed it with visible effort. $1,200 is still half what the land is worth. What the land was worth, Vance corrected gently. The drought has changed everything. The market has collapsed. You cannot sell to anyone else at any price because no one else is buying. We are your only option. The words were delivered with the calm certainty of a man stating simple facts. There was no anger in them, no frustration. Vance was not trying to convince Samuel. He was explaining reality as he had constructed it. Samuel played his next card carefully. I heard you bought land from several of my fellow veterans. Bill Hodges, Tom Wade, the others. They sold to you and then died shortly after. That seems like an unfortunate pattern. For the first time, Vance's expression shifted. Something cold moved behind his eyes there and gone in an instant. But Samuel saw it. After 40 years of reading men, he had learned to catch the truth in the space between words. Accidents are tragically common, Mr. Thornton, particularly among men of advancing years with physical limitations. But I assure you, all of those men signed their agreements voluntarily. Their families received full payment. The transactions were entirely legal. Legal and moral are not always the same thing. Vance's smile was thin as winter ice. No, they are not. But legality is what matters in court. Morality is a luxury for people who can afford it. The mask had slipped again. Vance could not help himself. He needed Samuel to understand the futility of resistance. Pride demanded it. Samuel shifted in his chair, letting the movement look like pain-driven discomfort. How did you know I had no livestock? When Mr. Crane visited, he mentioned it, but he could not have seen the empty pastures from the road. Vance's pause lasted only a second, but it was enough. A careful man would have invented a plausible explanation. An arrogant man admitted the truth. We do our research, Mr. Thornton. Before making any offer, we ensure we understand the complete financial picture of the property owner. It helps us make appropriate valuations. So you investigated me before approaching me. We investigated your property. It is standard business practice. And the others? Did you investigate them too before their accidents? Vance leaned back in his chair. The leather creaked softly. His eyes held Samuel's without blinking, and in that moment, Samuel saw the calculation happening behind them. Vance was deciding how much to admit, how far to push, whether this broken old man posed any real threat. Mr. Thornton, I am going to tell you something I do not usually share with clients. Wyoming is changing. The railroad will transform this territory into something new. Progress requires sacrifice. Some men understand that and prosper. Others resist and suffer. The choice is entirely yours, but the outcome is predetermined. I am offering you a chance to be on the side that prospers. Samuel absorbed the words, filed them away in memory alongside everything else Vance had said. Then he stood using the walking stick to lever himself upright with convincing difficulty. I need more time to think. Vance's expression hardened by degrees. Time is the one thing I cannot give you, Mr. Thornton. The tax deadline is June 15th. Today is June 10th. You have 5 days before the county seizes your property for non-payment. After that, I can purchase it from the county for a fraction of what I am offering you now. Take the $1,200 while you still can. Samuel turned toward the door, moving with the shuffling gait he had practiced for 6 weeks. As he reached for the handle, Vance spoke again. Mr. Thornton, one final thought. Men in your position often experience accidents, falls, fires, unexpected illnesses. It would be a shame if something happened to you before you made a wise decision. A terrible shame. Samuel did not turn around. He let his shoulders sag as though the weight of the threat had physically pressed him down. Then he opened the door and left. He maintained the performance all the way down the stairs and into the street. Only when he reached the edge of town did he allow himself to straighten slightly to breathe more easily. But he kept the prosthetic in place. Vance would have men watching. The performance had to continue. Deputy Cole waited at the ranch when Samuel arrived. The younger man's face showed concern that deepened when Samuel explained what had happened. He threatened you openly. That is more than we hoped for. Samuel shook his head as he removed the prosthetic with relief that bordered on pain. It is not enough. Any lawyer worth his fee could argue that Vance was merely warning me about the general dangers faced by elderly men living alone. We need more. We need him to act. What are you planning? Samuel walked to the window and looked out at the failing light. I am planning to refuse one final time. And then I am planning to disappear for a few hours so they think I have run. Fear makes predators reckless. Recklessness makes them sloppy. That is extremely dangerous. Yes, Cole said quietly. It is. The refusal letter went out the next morning. Samuel dictated it to Cole in Caleb Thornton's uncertain voice, each word chosen to maximize the impression of stubborn foolishness. He would not sell at any price. The land held his wife's grave and his last connection to the life he had built. He would rather die than abandon it. Cole delivered the letter personally to Vance's office. He reported that Vance read it without expression, thanked him, and dismissed him. But Cole had seen enough men preparing for violence to recognize the signs. Vance's jaw tightened. His fingers drummed once on the desk. Then he stood and walked to the map on the wall, studying the red pins with the intensity of a general planning a campaign. They will come tonight, Cole said when he returned to the ranch. I would stake my badge on it. Samuel nodded. He had reached the same conclusion. Vance was under pressure from the railroad. The deadline for securing the complete right-of-way was approaching. He could not afford to wait for Caleb Thornton to die of natural causes or financial collapse. He needed the property immediately, and that meant removing the obstacle immediately. Samuel spent the afternoon preparing. He cleaned his Colt and checked the cylinder. 6 rounds, each one loaded with care that had become ritual over decades. He had killed men before, though not in 20 years. He preferred not to kill again. But if Harris and Vance forced the choice between his life and theirs, Samuel would make that choice without hesitation. At sunset, he saddled his horse and rode toward town. Anyone watching would assume Caleb Thornton was running, fleeing in panic from threats he could no longer bear. But Samuel rode only as far as the ravine, 2 miles from the ranch where Cole waited with supplies. "They will search the house when they find you gone," Cole said. "Let them. They will find nothing but the possessions of a poor man. Everything important is already with Judge Cooper." Samuel tied his horse in the ravine, where it would be hidden from casual observation. Then he and Cole returned to the ranch on foot, moving through the darkness with the practiced silence of men who had spent years hunting and being hunted. They took positions in the barn where gaps in the wallboards provided clear views of the house and the approach road. The wait began. Time moved differently in darkness. Minutes stretched, hours compressed. Samuel's hip ached from the afternoon spent in the prosthetic. His back protested the cold and the stillness. But he had learned patience long ago in circumstances far worse than this. He could wait as long as necessary. The riders came at midnight, 3 of them moving without lanterns, trusting moonlight and familiarity with the road. Samuel recognized Richard Crane's bulk in the lead. The other 2 were younger men, hired muscle with the look of men who had done this work before. They dismounted 50 yards from the house and approached on foot. Crane tried the door and found it unlocked. Samuel had left it that way deliberately. They entered with caution, guns drawn. Through the window, Samuel watched lamplight bloom as they searched room by room. 5 minutes passed. Then Crane emerged and gestured to the others. They spread out, checking the barn, the chicken coop, the small storage shed. One of them found Samuel's horse missing from the corral and reported back to Crane. The old man ran, one of them said, voice carrying in the still air, probably halfway to Cheyenne by now. Crane shook his head. "Check the bedroom again. See if he took clothes supplies. If he ran, he would have packed." They returned to the house. More time passed. Then Crane came out alone and stood in the yard thinking. Samuel watched him through the gap in the barn wall, close enough to see the frustration on the man's face. "Burn it," Crane said finally. "If he comes back, there will be nothing to come back to. If he does not, we file a claim on abandoned property." One of the younger men hesitated. "What if someone sees the fire?" the sheriff. Crane's laugh was ugly. "Hayes knows better than to notice fires on properties we want. Light it and let us be done with this." They moved with practiced efficiency. One produced a can of kerosene from his saddlebag. They splashed it across the porch and through the open door. The sharp smell of fuel cut through the night air. Then Crane struck a match. The moment the match touched kerosene, Samuel stood. His voice cut through the darkness with the authority of 4 decades carrying a badge. "United States Marshal, drop your weapons and put your hands where I can see them." All 3 men froze. Crane's hand moved toward his gun, then stopped as he saw the Colt in Samuel's hand and the badge on his chest reflecting firelight. Deputy Cole emerged from the other side of the barn, rifle leveled. "Richard Crane, you are under arrest for attempted arson on, trespassing, conspiracy to commit murder, and 7 counts of murder in connection with the deaths of Bill Hodges, Tom Wade, Owen Mills, Carl Ross, James Dunn, Luke Shaw, and Jacob Miller." Crane's face twisted through shock, recognition, and calculation in quick succession. "You are the cripple, Thornton." Samuel allowed himself a cold smile. "There is no Caleb Thornton. There is only me. And you just confessed to arson in front of 2 sworn law officers. Your employer will be arrested before sunrise." Crane's hand moved again, faster this time, reaching for his gun. Samuel had expected this, had known it would come. He fired once. The shot took Crane in the shoulder, spinning him sideways. His gun clattered to the dirt. The 2 younger men dropped their weapons immediately and raised their hands. Cole moved in to secure them while Samuel kept his Colt trained on Crane. "You are making a mistake," Crane gasped, clutching his shoulder. "Vance has friends, important friends. This will not stand." "I am counting on it," Samuel said. "When men with power protect a murderer, it tells me the corruption runs deeper than one businessman. And I intend to burn out every bit of rot I find." Cole bound Crane's wound and secured all 3 prisoners. They extinguished the fire before it could spread beyond the porch. Then they rode for Cheyenne, with their prisoners arriving as dawn broke over the territorial capital. The arrest of Harrison Vance happened at 8 in the morning. Samuel and 4 other marshals entered his office without knocking. Vance looked up from his desk with an expression of irritation that shifted to alarm as he saw the badges. "Harrison Vance, you are under arrest for conspiracy to commit murder fraud, bribery of public officials and racketeering. Stand up and place your hands on your desk. Vance remained seated. There has been some mistake. I am a legitimate businessman with connections to the territorial governor. You cannot simply barge in here and make baseless accusations. Samuel placed a folder on the desk. Inside were documents seized from Vance's personal safe the night before, removed under a warrant Judge Cooper had signed, financial records showing payments to Sheriff Hayes, contracts with the railroad contingent on acquiring specific properties, a ledger listing the 7 dead veterans with notations like completed and property secured. We found your insurance policy, Samuel said. You kept records of everything in case your partners tried to betray you. Those records are now evidence. Stand up. Vance's face went pale. He stood slowly, his hands trembling, as he placed them on the desk. This was the moment Samuel had worked toward for 3 months. The moment when a man who believed himself untouchable learned he had been wrong. Who are you, Vance asked. Samuel removed the prosthetic leg from inside his coat and placed it on the desk next to the folder. I am the cripple you thought you were hunting, and you are under arrest. The trial began in August, held in federal court to avoid the tainted local system. The territorial prosecutor brought charges against Harrison Vance, Richard Crane, Sheriff Dalton Hayes, and 3 hired enforcers. The evidence was overwhelming. The financial records, the pattern of deaths, Crane's confession in exchange for a reduced sentence, and Samuel's testimony delivered over 2 days in meticulous detail. The courtroom filled beyond capacity. Every seat taken, people standing against the walls. The families of the dead veterans sat in the front rows, watching with expressions that ranged from grief to cold satisfaction. Samuel took the stand on the 3rd day. He wore his marshal's uniform, and the wooden leg displayed now as evidence rather than disguise. The prosecutor led him through the investigation step by step. The discovery of the pattern, the creation of Caleb Thornton, the infiltration and documentation of Vance's operation. Marshal Blackwood, why did you choose this particular method of investigation, the prosecutor asked. Because predators reveal their true nature only when they believe they are safe, Samuel replied. Harrison Vance was too careful to threaten a U.S. Marshal, but he had no hesitation threatening a disabled veteran he believed was helpless. He needed to believe I was weak before he would show me his strength. So I gave him the weakness he expected. The prosecutor gestured to the prosthetic leg. You wore this device for how long? 3 months. 4 hours a day, sometimes more. It caused genuine pain, which helped sell the illusion. Vance and his men saw what they wanted to see because it fit their pattern. They hunted vulnerable men, so I became vulnerable. The defense attorney, a sharp-faced man named Edmund Price, brought from Boston specifically for this trial, rose for cross-examination. His strategy was clear from the first question. Marshal Blackwood, you engaged in deception. You created a false identity. You obtained property under a fictitious name. How is this different from the fraud you accuse my client of committing? Samuel met his eyes without flinching. I broke no laws. Judge Cooper knew my true identity and authorized the land deed as part of an ongoing investigation. Every transaction was documented and legal. I deceived criminals, not the law. You manipulated my client into making statements by pretending to be someone you were not. Is that not entrapment? Entrapment requires law enforcement to induce someone to commit a crime they would not otherwise commit. Your client had already killed 7 men before I ever met him. I simply gave him an 8th opportunity and documented his methods. Price shifted tactics. You are 68 years old. You recently lost your wife. Is it not possible that grief impaired your judgment, that you created an elaborate fantasy to give your life purpose? My wife died 6 months before I began this investigation. Grief did not impair my judgment. It clarified it. Margaret asked me to find work that mattered. Stopping the murder of veterans mattered more than any case I ever worked. The courtroom was silent. Price had no response. He returned to his seat. The prosecution called Mrs. Dorothy Chen next. She walked to the stand with dignity, her gray hair pulled back, her dress simple and black. She placed her hand on the Bible and swore to tell the truth. Mrs. Chen, you were Jacob Miller's neighbor. Tell the jury what you witnessed. Her voice never wavered. I saw 2 men visit Jacob 2 weeks before he died. One wore an expensive suit. The other was large and threatening. Jacob shouted at them to leave his property. After they left, Jacob came to my house. He was shaken. He told me if anything happened to him, I should remember he would never sell his land voluntarily. 2 weeks later, he was dead. Can you identify the men you saw? She pointed at the defense table. Harrison Vance and Richard Crane. The jury leaned forward. This was the moment when the pattern became personal, when statistics became a man with a name and a neighbor who mourned him. Under cross-examination, Price tried to shake her testimony. How can you be certain it was my client? It was 2 years ago. Mrs. Chen looked at him with the patience of a woman who had outlived a husband and raised children and knew truth when she spoke it. I am certain because I watched them kill my friend and walk away unpunished. You do not forget faces like that. Price had no more questions. Richard Crane testified on the fourth day. His shoulder still bore the scar from Samuel's bullet. He had agreed to testify against Vance in exchange for life imprisonment instead of hanging. His testimony was clinical and devastating. Mr. Vance hired me in 1889. My job was to convince property owners to sell. If they refused, I was to make their refusal impossible. How did you accomplish that? Crane looked at his hands. By killing them in ways that looked accidental. Bill Hodges, I kicked him in the head and blamed his horse. Tom Wade, I held underwater until he drowned. Owen Mills, I pushed off a cliff. Jacob Miller, I shoved down the stairs. Each time Sheriff Hayes ruled it an accident and closed the investigation. On whose orders? Harrison Vance's. He never said kill them directly. He would say problems need permanent solutions or this situation requires closure. I understood what he meant. How much were you paid? $75 per completed job. The jury's faces showed revulsion. Price tried to discredit Crane during cross-examination, but the specifics were too detailed, too consistent with the evidence. Crane knew things only the killer could know. Sheriff Dalton Hayes testified with immunity in exchange for his cooperation. He admitted taking monthly payments from Vance. He admitted falsifying accident reports. He admitted turning a blind eye to murders he knew were happening. His testimony filled in the final gaps in the prosecution's case. The defense called no witnesses. Vance himself declined to testify. Price's closing argument focused on reasonable doubt, on the unreliability of criminals testifying for reduced sentences, on the possibility that Samuel's elaborate deception had manufactured evidence rather than discovered it. The prosecutor's closing was simpler. 7 men are dead. All veterans, all disabled, all refusing to sell land to the defendant. The pattern is undeniable. The evidence is overwhelming. The witnesses are credible. Justice demands accountability. The jury deliberated for 3 hours. When they returned, the foreman stood and faced the judge. On the charge of conspiracy to commit murder, how do you find guilty? On 7 counts of murder in the first degree, how do you find guilty on all counts? The courtroom erupted. The judge gavelled for order. Harrison Vance sat motionless, his face empty of expression. Richard Crane stared at the table. Sheriff Hayes wept quietly. Sentencing came a week later. Harrison Vance received death by hanging. Richard Crane received life imprisonment with no possibility of parole. Sheriff Hayes received 25 years in federal prison. The families of the victims stood outside the courthouse after the verdict. Mrs. Chen found Samuel in the crowd. She took his hand in both of hers. Thank you, Marshal. Jacob can rest now. Samuel shook his head gently. I only did what should have been done 2 years ago. I am sorry it took so long. You risked your life, pretended to be what those evil men hunted. That took courage I cannot measure. It took anger, Mrs. Chen, and a dead wife who made me promise not to waste my remaining years. She squeezed his hand once more and walked away. Samuel watched her go, feeling something he had not felt since Margaret died. Not happiness exactly, but purpose fulfilled. Work completed. The property seized from Laramie Land Company was returned to the families of the victims. Mrs. Chen received Jacob Miller's 160 acres. The other families received their land or fair compensation. The railroad found an alternative route that required purchasing property at market rates from willing sellers. Wyoming passed legislation requiring independent investigation of any accidental death involving property worth more than $1,000. It was a small reform, but it would save lives. Samuel retired officially in September of 1891. The ceremony was brief. He received commendations and a pension, but the words meant less to him than the letters he received from the families of the 7 dead veterans. Those letters, carefully folded and kept in a drawer, reminded him why the work had mattered. But retirement brought a problem Samuel had not anticipated. Purpose fulfilled left a void. He rattled around his empty house, restless and unmoored. Margaret was gone. The work was done. What remained? The answer arrived in November in the form of a knock on his door. Samuel opened it to find a woman he vaguely recognized from church, her face drawn with grief. Marshall Blackwood. "I am Ruth Alcott. My nephew Thomas, he is 3 years old. His parents just died of typhoid. I am too ill to care for him myself. The county wants to put him in an orphanage, but I thought you have no children and he has no one, and perhaps—" She trailed off, uncertain. Samuel looked past her to the wagon where a small boy sat wrapped in a blanket, eyes huge in a thin face. "Bring him inside," Samuel said. Thomas Blackwood grew up in that house, raised by a man old enough to be his great-grandfather, but determined to see him into adulthood. Samuel taught him to ride and shoot and track. He taught him about justice and mercy and the difference between the two. And when Thomas turned 18 and announced he was enlisting to fight in the Great War, Samuel told him the story of Caleb Thornton. On the porch in 1917, Samuel's voice finally fell silent. The oil lamp had burned low. Stars wheeled overhead in patterns unchanged since the world began. Thomas sat without moving, processing everything he had heard. Finally, he spoke. "So you pretended to be weak to catch a killer. And now I am going to war, where weakness will get me killed. What is the lesson?" Grandfather Samuel leaned forward in his rocking chair. "The lesson is that strength has many faces. On the battlefield, yes, you must be hard and fast and unbreakable. But there will be other moments, other battles where the best weapon is the one your enemy never sees. Sometimes the strongest thing a man can do is appear weak until the moment he chooses to be strong." He reached out and gripped Thomas's shoulder. "You will face men with guns and gas and artillery. Face them with courage. But you will also face men with power and influence who use others to do their killing. Face them with strategy. Be harder than the first. Be smarter than the second. And never ever let them mistake restraint for weakness." Thomas nodded slowly. "I understand. Do you? Because this is important. The war will end someday. You will come home changed. The question is whether you come home with your strength intact or your soul damaged by what you had to do. Remember that true strength is knowing when to fight and when to wait, when to stand tall and when to kneel, when to show your power and when to hide it until the moment it matters most." The night deepened around them. In the distance, a train whistle sounded, the same train that would carry Thomas away in the morning. Samuel listened to it fade and thought about all the trains he had heard over 40 years, all the journeys that ended and began, all the choices that defined a life. "Tomorrow you leave," he said quietly. "When you come back, and you will come back, Thomas, we will sit on this porch again, and you will tell me your stories. And I will listen the way I hope you have listened tonight. I will come back," Thomas promised, "and I will remember everything you taught me." The lamp guttered and went dark. They sat together in the darkness, grandfather and grandson, connected by blood and stories and the understanding that strength, real strength, was something the world rarely recognized until long after it mattered. The train departed Cheyenne at dawn, carrying Thomas Blackwood toward a war that would reshape the world. Samuel stood on the platform long after the locomotive disappeared into the eastern horizon, his hand raised in farewell to empty air. The gesture felt necessary even in absence of physical manifestation of hope that the boy would return. He walked home slowly, feeling his 94 years in every joint and muscle. The house waited silent and familiar. Inside, he sat in his reading chair and allowed himself a moment of pure exhaustion. The telling of the story had taken something from him, some reserve of strength he had been hoarding without knowing it. But the story was not finished. Not yet. The parts he had told Thomas covered the hunt and the capture, the strategy and the confrontation. What remained was the reckoning, the price paid by guilty and innocent alike, and the legacy that grew from ashes. Samuel closed his eyes and let memory carry him back one final time, not to 1891, but to the autumn of that same year and to the federal courthouse in Cheyenne, where justice moved with the grinding inevitability of millstones. The trial of Harrison Vance began on the first Monday of August, when heat pressed down on the territorial capital like a physical weight. The courthouse was a new building, Constructed of red brick and territorial pride, its courtroom designed to accommodate the growing population's need for civilized justice. On this day, every seat filled before the doors opened. People stood 3 deep along the walls. The families of 7 dead veterans claimed the front rows, their faces carrying the weight of years spent waiting for this moment. Samuel sat in the witness gallery, no longer wearing the disguise of Caleb Thornton. He had shaved his beard to a neat trim. His clothes fit properly. The prosthetic leg rested in a wooden box marked as Evidence Exhibit A, in a case built on deception used to reveal truth. He looked like what he was, a U.S. Marshal of 42 years who had sacrificed comfort and safety to catch a killer. Harrison Vance entered the courtroom, flanked by his attorney, Edmund Price, a man whose reputation had traveled from Boston ahead of him. Price was in his 50s, silver-haired and sharp-featured, dressed in a suit that cost more than most men earned in 6 months. He carried himself with the confidence of someone who had never lost a case he cared about winning. Vance, by contrast, looked diminished. The expensive suit remained, but the man inside it had shrunk. His face carried the grayness of someone who had not slept well in weeks. Richard Crane sat at a separate table, already having accepted his plea agreement. His shoulder bore fresh bandaging from where Samuel's bullet had torn through muscle. He avoided looking at Vance, avoided looking at anyone. Sheriff Dalton Hayes occupied a third table, his bulk spilling over the chair's arms, his face slick with nervous sweat despite the morning hour. The judge entered, and the room rose as one. Honorable Robert Thornton took his seat behind the bench, a man of 60 with iron-gray hair and a reputation for fairness that had survived 30 years on the territorial bench. He bore no relation to the fictional Caleb Thornton, a coincidence that had caused some amusement during the investigation, but now seemed unremarkable against the weight of what was to come. The charges were read: 7 counts of murder in the first degree, conspiracy to commit murder, fraud, bribery of public officials, racketeering. The list continued for several minutes. Vance showed no reaction as each charge fell like stones into still water. "How does the defendant plead?" Judge Thornton asked. Price rose smoothly. "Not guilty on all counts, Your Honor." Furthermore, the defense moves to dismiss all charges on the grounds that the evidence was obtained through entrapment and illegal deception by a law enforcement officer. The motion had been expected. The prosecutor, U.S. Attorney George Stapleton, a bulldog of a man with thinning hair and relentless preparation, responded without rising. "The defense will have ample opportunity to make that argument, Your Honor. But the facts will show that Marshal Blackwood conducted a lawful investigation using methods approved by this court through properly executed warrants. No entrapment occurred. The defendant's crimes preceded and existed independently of the investigation." Judge Thornton nodded. "Motion denied. We will proceed to jury selection." The process took 2 days. Price challenged anyone who had served in the military, anyone who owned property in Laramie County, anyone who showed the slightest hint of sympathy for veterans. Stapleton challenged anyone with significant financial holdings, anyone who had business dealings with railroad companies, anyone who looked like they might value property rights over human life. They settled on 12 men: farmers, shopkeepers, a blacksmith, a teacher, 2 former miners. Men who worked with their hands and understood the value of honest labor. Men who would recognize the difference between business and murder. Opening statements began on Wednesday morning. Stapleton walked to the jury box without notes. "Gentlemen, this case is about a simple truth. 7 men died so 1 man could get rich. 7 veterans who survived the bloodiest war this nation has ever known came home to build lives on land they earned through service. They were not wealthy men. They were not powerful men. But they owned something Harrison Vance wanted, and when they refused to sell, he had them killed." He paused, letting the words settle. "The defense will tell you this is a complex case about business practices and unfortunate coincidences. They will suggest that Marshal Blackwood manufactured evidence through deception. They will argue that their client is a legitimate businessman caught in an overzealous investigation. But the facts are not complex. The evidence is not manufactured, and Harrison Vance is not a victim." Stapleton gestured to the evidence table where the prosthetic leg sat alongside folders of documents. "We will show you financial records proving payments to corrupt officials. We will show you contracts contingent on acquiring properties through any means necessary. We will show you a pattern so clear, so undeniable, that only willful blindness could miss it. And we will show you that when a decorated U.S. Marshal put himself at risk to expose this pattern, Harrison Vance tried to have him killed too. He returned to his seat. Price rose, buttoning his suit jacket with practiced precision. Gentlemen of the jury, my name is Edmund Price and I represent Mr. Harrison Vance, a businessman whose only crime was succeeding in a difficult market. Yes, he purchased land. Yes, some of those land sales involved tragic deaths. But correlation is not causation. Tragedy is not murder. And an elaborate performance by a grief-stricken marshal does not constitute evidence. Price's voice carried the rolling cadence of courtroom oratory perfected over decades. Marshal Blackwood lost his wife 6 months before beginning this investigation. A devastating loss for any man, particularly one at the end of a long career seeking meaning in his final years. In his grief, he constructed a conspiracy where none existed. He created a fictional character, obtained property under false pretenses, and manipulated my client into statements taken out of context. This is not law enforcement. This is obsession masquerading as justice. He pointed at the prosthetic leg. That device represents deception. It represents a law officer who abandoned proper procedure in favor of theatrical manipulation. It represents evidence obtained through methods that violate the spirit, if not the letter of the law. And when you examine this case through the lens of proper legal standards, rather than emotional appeals to veteran sympathy, you will find reasonable doubt. And reasonable doubt demands acquittal. Price sat down. The battle lines had been drawn, truth against technique, evidence against eloquence. The prosecution began its case with Mrs. Dorothy Chen. She walked to the witness stand with quiet dignity, placed her hand on the Bible, and swore to tell the whole truth. Stapleton approached her gently. Mrs. Chen, how long did you know Jacob Miller? 23 years, since he first claimed his homestead. He was a good neighbor and a good man. Tell the jury what you witnessed 2 weeks before his death. Chen's voice never wavered as she described the two men in the expensive buggy, the argument, Jacob firing his rifle into the air to drive them away. She described Jacob's visit to her home afterward, his fear that something would happen to him, his insistence that she remember he would never sell voluntarily. Can you identify the men you saw that day? She pointed at the defense table. That man in the expensive suit is Harrison Vance. The large man beside him is Richard Crane. Stapleton produced a photograph. Is this Jacob Miller? Yeah, that was Jacob. And where is he now? Dead. They killed him and called it an accident. Price objected immediately. Move to strike your honor. The witness is speculating. Judge Thornton nodded. The jury will disregard the witness's conclusion about cause of death. Mrs. Chen, please confine yourself to what you personally observed. Under cross-examination, Price attacked her certainty. How can you be sure the men you saw were my client and Mr. Crane? It was 2 years ago. Memory fades. Mrs. Chen met his eyes without flinching. I watched those men threaten my friend. 2 weeks later, he was dead. You do not forget faces like that, Mr. Price. You remember them every night when you cannot sleep. Price had no response. He dismissed the witness. The prosecution called Deputy Marshal James Cole next. Cole described the investigation from his perspective, the surveillance of the ranch, the recordings of conversations the moment Richard Crane attempted arson. His testimony was precise and professional, exactly what jurors expected from law enforcement. Then Stapleton called Samuel. The courtroom stirred as Samuel walked to the witness stand. He moved without the prosthetic, and now his natural gait steady despite his years. He placed his hand on the Bible and swore the oath he had sworn countless times before. Stapleton began with Samuel's credentials. 42 years as a U.S. Marshal, hundreds of arrests, dozens of successful prosecutions, a record of service that spoke for itself. Then they moved to the investigation. Marshal Blackwood, when did you first suspect Harrison Vance of criminal activity? When I saw the pattern, 7 veterans dead, all refusing to sell land, all their properties acquired by the same company. Sheriff Hayes ruling every death accidental despite evidence suggesting otherwise. The pattern was too consistent to be coincidence. What did you do with that suspicion? I could have arrested Vance on suspicion, but suspicion is not proof. His lawyers would have destroyed the case before it reached trial. So I needed to make him reveal himself. I needed to become the kind of target he could not resist. Explain how you accomplished that. I created Caleb Thornton, a disabled veteran who fit Vance's victim profile perfectly. I acquired property legally under that name with court approval. I documented every interaction with Vance and his associates, and I waited for them to show their true nature. Stapleton held up the prosthetic leg. Tell the jury about this device. Samuel described the construction, the training, and the pain of wearing it for hours. He explained how the physical discomfort made the performance genuine, how Vance and Crane saw what they wanted to see because it matched their expectations. Did you entrap Harrison Vance? Number entrapment requires inducing someone to commit a crime they would not otherwise commit. Vance had already killed 7 men before I ever contacted him. I simply gave him an 8th opportunity and documented his methods. He chose to threaten me. He chose to order my property burned. Those were his decisions, not mine. What did Harrison Vance say to you during your meeting in his office? Samuel recited the conversation from memory, word for word. Vance's admission that he had investigated Caleb Thornton before approaching him. His knowledge of details he should not have known. His veiled threats about accidents. His statement that progress requires sacrifice, and some men resist and suffer. The jury leaned forward, absorbing every detail. When Richard Crane came to burn your property, what happened? Samuel described the arrest, the confession caught in the moment of commission. Crane's words about lighting the fire and being done with it. The attempted shooting that ended with Crane wounded and in custody. Under cross-examination, Price attacked from multiple angles. Marshall Blackwood, you created a false identity. You obtained property under a fictitious name. You deceived everyone you encountered. How is this different from fraud? All documentation was legal and court approved. Judge Cooper knew my true identity. The land deed was obtained as part of an authorized investigation. I deceived criminals, not the legal system. You manipulated my client into making statements by pretending to be someone you were not. Is that not entrapment? Your client threatened to kill me if I did not sell my property. That threat came from his own will, not my manipulation. I created an opportunity. He chose to seize it through violence. You are 68 years old. Your wife recently died. Is it possible that grief impaired your judgment, that you constructed an elaborate scenario to give your final years meaning? Samuel's eyes hardened. Grief did not impair my judgment, Mr. Price. It clarified it. My wife asked me to find work that mattered. Stopping the murder of veterans mattered more than any case I ever worked. And the evidence speaks for itself regardless of my emotional state. Price had no answer to that. He returned to his seat and Samuel stepped down. The prosecution's case continued for days. Financial experts testified about the payments to Sheriff Hayes, the railroad contracts contingent on property acquisition, the offshore accounts where Vance hid his profits. A handwriting expert confirmed that the threatening notes matched samples from Crane's hand. The county assessor testified that no tax increases had been planned, contradicting Vance's claims of financial pressure on property owners. Then Richard Crane took the stand. He had agreed to testify in exchange for life imprisonment instead of hanging. He walked to the witness box with his arms still in a sling, his face carrying the look of a man who knew he was damned but hoped to ease his fall. Stapleton took him through it methodically. The hiring by Vance in 1889. The instructions to convince property owners to sell by any means necessary. The coded language Vance used to order killings without saying the words directly. How many men did you kill on Harrison Vance's orders? 4. Bill Hodges, Tom Wade, Owen Mills, Jacob Miller. Describe how you killed Jacob Miller. Crane's voice went flat, emotionless. I entered through a window I had forced earlier that night. Jacob heard the noise and came down to investigate. When he reached the stairs, I stepped out behind him and pushed. He fell, broke his neck. I left through the window and reported to Mr. Vance the next day that the problem had been resolved. What did Mr. Vance say? He said good work and paid me $75. The jury's faces showed revulsion and horror in equal measure. This was not abstract anymore. This was a man describing murder with the casual tone of someone discussing routine business. Price tried to discredit Crane during cross-examination, suggesting he was lying to save his own life. But Crane's details were too specific, too consistent with evidence already presented. And his admission of his own guilt carried a weight that made his accusations against Vance more credible, not less. Sheriff Dalton Hayes testified with immunity, his voice thick with shame. He admitted everything. The monthly payments from Vance, the falsified accident reports, the deliberate failure to investigate suspicious deaths. His testimony completed the picture of systematic corruption. The defense called no witnesses. Vance himself declined to testify, exercising his Fifth Amendment right against self-incrimination. Price's case rested entirely on attacking the credibility of the prosecution's witnesses and evidence. In his closing argument, Price spent 2 hours parsing legal definitions, questioning witness reliability, and suggesting alternative explanations for every piece of evidence. His performance was masterful in its way, a symphony of reasonable doubt conducted by a virtuoso. But Stapleton's closing was simpler and more powerful. Gentlemen, the defense has spent considerable time trying to make this case complicated. It is not complicated. 7 men are dead, all veterans, all disabled, all refusing to sell land that Harrison Vance wanted. The pattern is undeniable. The evidence is overwhelming. The witnesses are credible. He walked along the jury box, making eye contact with each man. Richard Crane confessed to murder and named Harrison Vance as the man who ordered it. Sheriff Hayes confessed to accepting bribes to cover up those murders. Financial records prove payments were made. The railroad contract proves motive. And Marshal Blackwood's investigation proves method. Stapleton returned to the center of the courtroom. The defense suggests Marshal Blackwood acted improperly, but everything he did was legal, authorized, and necessary. He could not catch these men through ordinary investigation because the local law enforcement was corrupt. So he became the bait that drew them into the open. That is not entrapment. That is good police work. He paused, letting silence build. 7 good men died because Harrison Vance valued money over human life. 7 families grieved because he saw disabled veterans as obstacles rather than human beings. This trial is their chance for justice. Do not let legal sophistry deny them what they have waited years to receive. The jury deliberated for 5 hours. When they returned, their faces showed the weight of what they had decided. The foreman, a farmer named Mitchell, who had lost a brother at Shiloh, stood to deliver the verdict. On the charge of conspiracy to commit murder, how do you find the defendant guilty? On 7 counts of murder in the first degree, how do you find the defendant guilty on all counts? The courtroom erupted. Some shouted in triumph. Others wept. Judge Thornton gabbled for order repeatedly before the noise subsided. Harrison Vance sat motionless, his face empty of all expression. Price placed a hand on his client's shoulder, but said nothing. There was nothing to say. Sentencing came a week later. Judge Thornton looked down from the bench at Harrison Vance with an expression of cold finality. Mr. Vance, you have been found guilty of 7 counts of murder in the first degree and multiple counts of conspiracy and fraud. The evidence showed premeditation, malice, and a complete disregard for human life. You targeted disabled veterans because you believed them easy prey. You corrupted law enforcement to shield your crimes. You accumulated wealth on the backs of dead men. The judge paused. This court sentences you to death by hanging, sentenced to be carried out on the first day of October 1891. May God have mercy on your soul, for this court has none. Richard Crane received life imprisonment without possibility of parole. Sheriff Dalton Hayes received 25 years in federal prison. The 3 hired enforcers received sentences ranging from 15 to 20 years. Outside the courthouse, the families of the victims gathered in the late afternoon sun. Mrs. Dorothy Chen found Samuel in the crowd. She approached him slowly, her eyes wet but her face composed. Thank you, Marshal Blackwood. Jacob can finally rest. Samuel took her hand gently. I only did what should have been done when he first died. I am sorry it took so long. You risked everything, became what they hunted to catch them. That takes courage I cannot measure. It took anger, Mrs. Chen, and a promise to my dead wife that I would not waste whatever years remain. She embraced him briefly, then walked away to join her family. Samuel watched her go, feeling something shift inside his chest. Not quite peace, but the beginning of it. The execution of Harrison Vance took place on a cold October morning. Samuel attended as a witness, standing among the crowd that gathered to see justice done. Vance walked to the gallows with dignity, refusing the hood, his face set in an expression that gave away nothing. When the trap dropped and the rope snapped taut, Samuel felt no satisfaction. Only the grim acknowledgement that some debts could only be paid in full. The property seized from Laramie Land Company was returned to the families of the victims. Mrs. Chen received Jacob Miller's 160 acres and the compensation she should have received years earlier. The other families received similar restitution. The railroad found an alternative route, purchasing land at fair market value from willing sellers. But the money and land could not return the dead. 7 men remained in graves scattered across Laramie County. 7 families had lost fathers, husbands, brothers. Justice had been served, but some wounds never fully healed. Samuel retired officially in September, 2 weeks before Vance's execution. The ceremony was brief and formal. The territorial governor presented him with a commendation for exceptional service. His fellow marshals gave him a gold watch engraved with his badge number. The speeches praised his dedication and courage. But the words felt hollow to Samuel. He had done his job. He had caught the killers. But Margaret was still dead, and the house was still empty, and retirement stretched ahead like a vast and purposeless plain. The darkness came in November. Samuel woke one morning and could not find a reason to rise. The day before had been the same, and the day before that. He performed the basic necessities of survival, eating little, sleeping poorly, moving through hours that felt identical and endless. Deputy Cole visited and found Samuel sitting in his reading chair staring at nothing. "Marshal, are you ill?" Samuel's response came slowly. "No, not ill, just empty." Cole sat down uninvited. "This is grief, for Mrs. Blackwood, and for the case being over. You need purpose, sir. You have always needed purpose. There is no more purpose. The work is done. Then find new work. There are other cases, other injustices. The world does not lack for wrongs that need righting." But Samuel shook his head. "I am 68 years old. How many years do I have left? I have 10, not enough to matter." Cole left frustrated and worried. He reported Samuel's condition to Judge Cooper, who visited the next day. The judge found Samuel in the same chair unchanged. "Samuel, you are scaring people who care about you." "I am fine." "You are not fine. You are disappearing into yourself." Margaret would not want this. The name broke through Samuel's fog. His eyes focused on the judge for the first time. Margaret is dead. The work that gave her death meaning is finished. What remains? Judge Cooper leaned forward. What remains is the same question every man faces when the work ends. Do you give up, or do you find something new worth living for? There is nothing new. I am too old. Then find something old. Find someone who needs what you can still give. The judge left. Samuel sat alone in the gathering darkness, turning the words over in his mind. The answer arrived 3 days later in the form of a knock on his door. Samuel answered to find Ruth Alcott, a woman from church whose face he vaguely recognized. She held a small boy by the hand. "Marshal Blackwood." "I am sorry to trouble you. This is my nephew Thomas. He is 3 years old. His parents died of typhoid last week. I am too ill with consumption to raise him myself, and the county wants to place him in an orphanage. But I remembered you have no children, and he has no one, and I thought perhaps you might consider." She trailed off, uncertain how to finish a request so enormous and desperate. Samuel looked down at the boy. Thomas Alcott stared back with huge blue eyes and a thin face. He clutched a worn stuffed rabbit, the only possession he had apparently been allowed to keep. He looked terrified and trying not to show it, a kind of courage that Samuel recognized from 1,000 different contexts. "Bring him inside," Samuel said. Thomas grew up in that house, raised by a man old enough to be his great-grandfather. The first weeks were difficult. Thomas woke screaming from nightmares about his parents. Samuel, who had never raised children, had no idea how to comfort him. But he tried. He sat beside the boy's bed and told him stories about the frontier, about tracking outlaws, about the difference between justice and revenge. Thomas listened with the intensity of someone grasping for anything solid in a world that had betrayed him. And slowly, imperceptibly, they became a family. Samuel taught Thomas to ride when the boy turned 5, to shoot when he turned 10, to track game through the Wyoming wilderness when he turned 12. But more than skills, Samuel taught him principles. Honor meant keeping your word even when it cost you. Courage meant doing the right thing even when you were afraid. Justice meant protecting those who could not protect themselves. And Thomas absorbed it all, grew straight and strong, became the kind of young man Samuel would have been proud to call a son. The years passed. Samuel's hair went from gray to white, his back bent slightly under the weight of decades. But he woke each morning with purpose again, the purpose of raising a good man in a world that needed good men. When Thomas turned 18 in 1917 and announced he was enlisting to fight in the Great War, Samuel felt the old darkness threaten to return. But this time he had armor against it. He had raised Thomas well. The boy would survive because Samuel had taught him how. On the evening before Thomas left, Samuel told him the story of Caleb Thornton for the first time. He told him about weakness as a weapon, about the difference between appearance and reality, about the moment when prey becomes predator. And Thomas, who had grown into a young man with his grandfather's eyes and his own fierce determination, understood exactly why the story mattered. The train carried Thomas away at dawn. Samuel stood on the platform until long after it disappeared, then walked home to wait. The war consumed 18 months. Letters arrived irregularly, censored and brief. Thomas wrote about rain and mud and rats, about friends lost to artillery and gas, about fear so profound it became a constant companion. But he also wrote about holding the line, about protecting his brothers in arms, about finding courage when courage seemed impossible. In November 1918, the war ended. Samuel received a telegram 3 days later. Thomas was coming home. He had been wounded but was alive. He arrived on a cold December morning. Samuel stood on the same platform where he had said goodbye 18 months earlier. The young man who stepped off the train looked like Thomas but moved differently. His left hand was missing, taken by German machine gun fire during the Battle of Belleau Wood. His eyes held shadows that had not been there before. They embraced without words. Samuel felt the thinness of his grandson's frame, the tremor of muscles pushed beyond endurance. But Thomas was alive. That was what mattered. At home, they sat by the fire. Thomas stared into the flames with the look of someone seeing things that were not there. "I lost it saving my squad," he said finally, gesturing to his missing hand. "German position we did not know about. I pulled 3 men to cover. The 4th died while I was getting the 3rd. You saved 3 lives. I lost 1. You cannot save everyone, Thomas. I learned that the hard way. You can only do what you can do and live with what you cannot." Thomas turned to look at his grandfather. "In France, I thought about your story, about Caleb Thornton, about pretending to be weak to catch the strong. There were moments when retreat was the only option, when appearing broken saved us from destruction. The other men thought I was a coward sometimes, but I remembered what you taught me. That strength has many faces." Samuel nodded slowly. "You survived. That is what matters, and you will build a life from what remains. The same way I did after Margaret died. The same way you did after your parents died." They sat in silence for a while. Then Thomas spoke again. "I want to do something. The men I served with, they are coming home broken, and the country does not know how to help them. Disabled veterans being taken advantage of. The same pattern you stopped with Vance. I want to build something that protects them." Samuel smiled for the first time in months. "What do you have in mind?" "An organization, legal aid for veterans, protection against predatory business practices. A place where men who cannot fight for themselves anymore can find someone to fight for them. That is good work, important work. I learned from the best." Samuel's health began to fail in early 1919. The decades of hard living extracted their final payment. He moved slowly, ate little, spent most days in his reading chair. But his mind remained sharp, and he watched Thomas build the organization with quiet pride. The Disabled Veterans Protection League opened its first office in Cheyenne that spring. Thomas ran it with the dedication of someone who had seen firsthand what happened when warriors came home to a country that had forgotten them. He helped veterans fight fraudulent contracts, predatory lenders, employers who exploited their disabilities. He became what Samuel had been, a shield for the vulnerable. In December 1919, Samuel's body finally surrendered. He died in his sleep on a cold night, peacefully with no pain. They found him in the morning, still sitting in his reading chair, his face serene. The funeral filled the church beyond capacity. Veterans from across Wyoming came to pay respects. The families of the 7 men killed by Harrison Vance attended. Mrs. Dorothy Chen, now 72 herself, placed a hand on the coffin and whispered a thank you that no one else heard. Thomas stood at the graveside as they lowered his grandfather into the ground beside Margaret Blackwood. The headstone was simple granite, engraved with Samuel's name dates, and a single line Thomas had chosen. "Strength lies not in standing tall, but in knowing when to kneel to rise again." After the service, after the mourners departed, Thomas remained alone at the grave. He thought about the stories Samuel had told, the lessons taught, the example set. He thought about the prosthetic leg in its case at home, the physical symbol of his grandfather's greatest lesson. Strength had many faces. Sometimes it looked like a marshal with a badge. Sometimes it looked like a crippled veteran barely surviving, and sometimes it looked like an old man raising an orphaned boy in a house full of ghosts. Thomas touched the headstone once, then walked away to continue the work his grandfather had begun. The years passed. The Disabled Veterans Protection League grew. Thomas opened offices in Denver, in Salt Lake City, and Billings. He trained others to do what Samuel had taught him, protecting those who could not protect themselves. He married, had children of his own, and told them stories about their great-grandfather who caught criminals by pretending to be weak. And on the wall of every office in a place of honor hung a photograph of Samuel Blackwood and the prosthetic leg he had worn to catch a killer. New clients would ask about it, and Thomas would tell them the story. About weakness as a weapon, about justice requiring patience, about the moment when prey becomes predator. The story lived on, passed from generation to generation, and the work continued, powered by the understanding that those who appeared weakest often possessed the greatest strength, if only someone gave them the chance to prove it. On the porch in Cheyenne in 1917, an old man had told his grandson a story about hunting predators. In offices across Wyoming in the decades that followed, that story became a legacy. Men and women who had sacrificed everything for their country found protection in an organization built on the principle that vulnerability could be strength, that appearance could deceive, and that justice sometimes required becoming what you hunted to catch, what hunted you. Samuel Blackwood had spent 42 years as a marshal, but his greatest legacy was not the criminals he caught or the cases he solved. It was the understanding he passed to Thomas, who passed it to others, that real strength was not about power or dominance. It was about knowing when to stand tall and when to kneel, when to show your teeth and when to hide them, when to be hard as iron and when to appear soft as snow. The predators of the world looked for easy prey, but sometimes the prey looked back. And when it did, with eyes clear and purpose sharp, the predators learned too late that they had mistaken the hunter for the hunted. That was Samuel Blackwood's final lesson, and it echoed long after the last shovel of dirt covered his grave, long after the last person who had known him personally had also passed into memory. The lesson lived in the work and the organization Thomas built, in the thousands of veterans who found protection when they needed it most. Strength lies not in standing tall, but in knowing when to kneel to rise again. The words on the headstone were more than epitaph. They were instruction manual, battle plan, and promise all at once. And they remained true long after the man who lived them had turned to dust beneath the Wyoming earth.